Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. I'm Ashok, one of your regular co-hosts, and I'm joined today by Evan.
Hi, it's Evan Botcher here from Melbourne in Australia. I'm the head of engineering for Thoughtworks in Australia. Give a little background. I wrote an article a few years ago on platform teams that included the concept of platform teams, and I do a lot of consulting around engineering organization design and how to shape teams. So that's what I'm bringing to the conversation today.
Brilliant. And that seems to be quite relevant and topical given the two guests that we have today to discuss Team Topologies, and who better to do that than the people who wrote the book themselves. So Matt, Manuel, would you introduce yourselves to our guests, please? To our listeners, sorry.
Sure. Hi, it's Matthew Skelton here, co-author of the book Team Topologies. I'm here with my co-author as well.
Hi, I'm Manuel. I'm, like Matthew said, the other co-author, and I do similar work to what Evan mentioned, helping organizations understand their sort of team structures and how to achieve faster flow.
So maybe we just start with something just to give our listeners, for people maybe who might have heard of Team Topologies and maybe even have sort of skimmed it, a brief sort of overview of the book and sort of what prompted it in the first place.
That's a great question. So what I realized the other day was effectively our book is, you can see it as a 215-page rant against a huge number of things that are wrong with software engineering in the kind of modern world. Because this is born out of our own experience working with organizations and seeing the frustration inside organizations and both at the engineering level, manager level, business level of things not kind of working well. We've been in situations ourselves where we've experienced a lot of the pain that we're trying to deal with in the book. And that's why the book ends up being really quite practical and opinionated and quite directive about how we think things should be arranged in order to make building and running software systems more effective in the current context. So that was our sort of aim in writing it, is to set forward this kind of set of patterns that should, we think, help organizations to become more effective at software delivery.
Yeah, it was also based on our experience. I mean, there are different inputs to the book. The main one was our experience consulting and seeing problems that different organizations were having in terms of trying to adopt Devops, continuous delivery, but then they didn't see the results. And then when you go a bit deeper, you see that they often had problems with misunderstandings between teams, lack of communication, the sort of people problems that we know are harder to solve. That's not just, having a new tool set, which, brings some benefits, but at the end of the day, if teams are not communicating or if they're over communicating, so those kind of problems. So the book helped get that message across on some of the patterns we saw working well and what didn't work so well. And fortunately, a lot of organizations have seen this as a sort of new vocabulary to talk about teams, purpose, and how to evolve the interactions between them.
Now, interestingly, Manuel and I both had a substantial amount of experience working in what's now known as CI/CD. So this kind of the center of the software delivery world, which is the deployment pipeline. Obviously, that's sort of popularized by the great book by Jason and Farley back in 2010. And we both did a lot of work around continuous delivery and thinking about how organizations are set up. And actually, continuous delivery, the concepts in there are absolutely foundational. And even since the book was published and more recently, I've realized how central it is to get those concepts embedded. That kind of the idea of an end-to-end flow of value in the organization, using the deployment pipeline, is without that, then we can't have a fast flow of change. A lot of the stuff in Team Topologies it's not going to happen because we need the solid engineering practices underneath. And so our experience working at that kind of the heart of the organization at the deployment pipeline level, I think shaped our thinking significantly around what the foundations are for an organization that can have a fast flow of change in the software space. Some other things some other influences on the book. I actually did a blog post back in 2013, looking at different kind of the different team responsibility boundaries. Back then, we called it sort of Devops. I mean, DevOps now means something different, but back then, DevOps was all kind of about thinking about the relationship between development teams and operations teams, as they were called then. And that blog post got lots of traction, lots of interest in the diagrams. They're kind of like Venn diagrams with kind of different colors representing different kinds of teams. And so Manuel and I then kind of turned that into a website called Devops Topologies, which is still there, all open source, well, Creative Commons. And that got even further traction and helped organizations including Netflix and Conway Nast International to think about their relationships between different teams and boundaries and different dynamics, basically, different trade-offs for different responsibility boundaries. And that led us to more conversations, and eventually we decided to go well beyond that original kind of Venn diagram static view of the world, and incorporate many other dimensions which are actually important. Things like Conway's law, so this socio-technical mirroring between the communication paths in the organization and the likely software architecture that typically results, or system architecture that results. But also things like team cognitive load, which is a term that we've effectively sort of invented or shaped in the book. Applying cognitive load at a team level is a very new concept. And then making sure that the organizations are evolvable, partly by introducing constraints on the types of teams and the types of interaction between teams. And effectively that combination of those constraints end up actually being what we call enabling constraints in a complex adaptive system. We're reducing the degrees of freedom that this organization can kind of use precisely so that we've got a better ability to listen to the signals that are happening inside the organization. So that's where we ended up. It was a journey of probably at least 10 years, I guess. Certainly from inspired by the continuous delivery book and a bunch of other things.
I've got to say that in ThoughtWorks, in our consulting work, it's actually been quite impactful, and the creative constraint around the limited number of patterns and a pattern language has been really, really powerful. In the work that we've done, and I know I've done, many of us at the time when we've picked up the book have said we have about 3 half-finished slide decks that we've done with clients to describe many of these patterns that have been emergent in organizations that we work with. But you're essentially doing that work to publish and explain these with them in such an articulate way has been really, really helpful. And some of them have been counter to a lot of the trends of the last few years of long-lived product-aligned teams, stream-aligned teams, to introduce some alternative patterns that have been a really great conversation starters, and actually sort of shattered some defaults that people have gone to and some dysfunction that's emerged as a part of it. I wonder how much, when you were putting together that material, how much of it was through observation of existing patterns in teams, and how much of it was your kind of ideation of like, this is a recommended way forward?
It's a combination of observation, what works, a bit of ideation, but also starting with some principles. Starting with fundamentally the principles of kind of really 3 things. If you want to summarize team topology, it's optimize for fast flow, rapid feedback, and limits on team cognitive load. And if you start with those 3 principles, I mean, the Conway's law stuff is kind of useful, but is not really absolutely at the heart of it, really, in some respects. If you look for organization designs that optimize for fast flow of change towards live systems, rapid feedback from those live systems so the teams can course correct, and limits on team cognitive load, then you will end up with a design that will end up with a set of principles and practices that look like team topologies. So that's fundamentally what you would get. You might have some slight differences. You might have 5 different types of team, or you might have 4 different interaction modes, fine. But if you start with those principles, then I would find it very difficult to see how you get something different. Because you want to avoid handoffs. for a fast flow. You don't want to have lots of waiting around for people to do different things. And you want that kind of end-to-end responsibility, so you're very close to the customer, whoever the customer is. And crucially, you can't expect teams to just take on more and more and more and more stuff. So you need to have the cognitive load limited. Therefore, you need to have something like a platform. You might call it something different, but you're going to have some of that kind of stack taken away from teams to help them focus on the stuff that's more germane and relevant. Effectively, we kind of start with those principles, and then looked and saw what different organizations were doing. And effectively, looking back, what we ended up doing is reverse engineering what some organizations were doing. So Amazon AWS is a classic example. Whether or not it's true, the memo from Jeff Bezos back in whenever it was 2002 saying, each team will communicate with other teams via a clear API and treat other teams as if they were external, or all services will be externalizable. This kind of two pizza thing. A lot of people miss the point of the two pizza team. It's nothing about food or what have you. It's about high trust and therefore a high degree of contextual awareness about changes, ability to make those changes very rapidly and course correct, and crucially, we're limiting the cognitive load on the teams by keeping them small. We cannot take on more and more and more stuff in the system. Therefore, we're going to have to compose our total solution out of a smaller number of discrete and nicely decoupled discrete services, which is kind of good software engineering practice, right? Good engineering practice in general. So we effectively did some reverse engineering on what was already out there and kind of worked out, well, actually, what's really going on at Amazon? Yeah, two pizza teams sound all nice and cutesy, but underneath that, a whole of really key principles that actually are fundamental to building scalable software systems. And so we tried to unpack them from other places too, and looked at kind of, for example, what Spotify were doing and what was the intent behind the Spotify model, as people started to call it. What was actually going on there that's not just the names of the teams and the kind of roles and that kind of stuff. And so that's what we tried to capture in Team Topologies, is this kind of reverse engineering of patterns that seemed to work well or seemed to have had some value at a particular point in time in certain contexts, and try and work out what problems they were trying to solve or what they were trying to solve for, what are the principles behind those, the external patterns, and reverse engineer that and then kind of characterize it in a way which was forward-looking.
At the end of the day, Team Topologies is, as Matthew mentioned earlier, is really focused on, if you want your organization to be able to respond faster, deliver faster, and also have healthy teams that are long-lived and that are sustainable. And so sometimes people ask us, what if an organization doesn't have those kind of requirements? And that's okay. Then maybe the Team Topology is not the ideal approach for them. We just don't see many organizations these days that can afford not to go too fast and adapt quickly as things change so fast. But even Team Topologies at the end of the day is sort of a trade-off you have to make, where if you want to introduce the ideas of Team Topologies, the constraints, the vocabulary and the understanding of why these constraints are useful, that's a bit of effort you have to invest so that you can then look at achieving fast flow. And in particular, stream-aligned teams, yes, those kind of long-lived teams, cross-functional with end-to-end responsibility, are hard to achieve, and they need to be kind of grown over time. It's not like we're going to create a new model today and tomorrow we have stream-aligned teams that are high performing. That's not how it's going to work. You need to invest in these teams. You need to look at what kind of support they're going to need in terms of platform, enabling teams, other things in terms of engineering practices, but also funding practices, etc., which is a little bit outside the scope of Team Topologies. But it has to be an investment in aligning to these ideas, these principles that Matthew was talking about, if you want to achieve, faster flow, being able to adapt quickly, and have healthy teams. And that might not be a trade-off that every organization wants to make, but we're not saying that everything about Team Topologies is going to be easy to adopt and make things much better, which is kind of the fallacy that, not because of who wrote the Spotify article or something like that, they were just explaining how this approach was helping Spotify at the time. But then when people kind of copy that and try to just replicate in the organization without understanding why are we doing this and what's different and how do we adapt this to our needs, then it sort of becomes a problem often with a lot of cargo culting and keywords that pop up and people want to follow, and without the benefits.
That was one reason why we wanted to avoid these like specific roles, a bit like, you've got like I don't know, from Scrum you've got like Scrum Master and whatnot, and from you might have these particularly kind of individual roles. We avoid that in Team Topologies precisely because we don't want to kind of really wanted to avoid yet another kind of I don't know, industry certification drive for people to kind of jump on this bandwagon and say, well, I'm a certified this, and therefore we're now officially Agile version 7 or whatever it is. So we took some care to try to avoid that kind of anti-pattern really, and try and emphasize the need for organizations to internalize the principles: fast flow, rapid feedback, limiting cognitive load on teams. High. Some other principles include like high trust, looking at the size of groups inside the organization and try to maximize the trust in there. Because if we've got high trust, we can have a faster flow of change, because we don't get the distrust that leads to people stopping things or wanting to kind of approve or inspect things. And so, by coming back to the key principles all the time, then we hope that there's more chance that organizations can actually kind of continuously adapt and evolve, rather than just latching onto, if you have a nice fixed set of teams that look like this, then all your problems will be solved. That's what we try to do anyway.
I think that transition, and Manuel, you're talking to that organizations that try to adopt an approach, and have been involved in organizations where they've tried to move towards product-aligned, long-lived team structures, but the underlying architecture does not match, and so the cognitive dissonance, I guess, that they bump into when they say no, but we want to have teams with independence and autonomy and ability to respond to a customer need, but actually the changes to the systems underneath they don't. We coined this years ago in the technology radar, the inverse Conway maneuver. It's a very painful process for many organizations as they realign into a new structure, but they and the architecture underneath has to tear itself apart. And in order to create that, and it takes time, causes a lot of pain, can be quite risky for some organizations. One of the things that appeals to me around the Team Topologies patterns is this concept of the complex subsystem, which does give us a language that describes some of these systems are not safe yet to take change from as a self-service way, or to be placed into the control of stream-aligned teams. So they may need some different sort of treatment. A question that came up, I think I saw a webinar recently of yourself talking to this, Matthew, was this complex subsystem team, and the distinction between that and a platform, or whether there's an evolution over time between those things. Is do they naturally fall into some sort of more self-service platform? I was interested.
So part of the challenge here is that we're seeing a fundamental shift in kind of organizational capabilities based on modern software, particularly cloud software, but cloud inspired software, we can say things like infrastructure as code, stuff like this. Going back 20 years, making changes to how your business runs or the kind of services you provide it took some time. Now, potentially, particularly if what you provide has an online digital element to it, maybe all of it is there. But let's say insurance. Back in the day, 20 years ago, someone would maybe visit a website, but probably just telephone or send an email or something. Now it's all self-service via the customer themselves. They can log in, they can change their insurance details, they can request a new quote, and a lot of the calculation of that new insurance premium is done automatically or semi-automatically. It's digitally enabled. We're not saying every organization is a software company. I think that's misguided. But every organization now that wants to maintain a competitive or some sort of differentiation can use software to do so. And so we're able to make changes that are much more rapid. What this is showing up is that lots of organizations do not have, often don't even have a clear picture of what they provide or their purpose. And approaches like Team Topologies, approaches like domain-driven design, approaches like data mesh are highlighting that lots of organizations have a huge lack of clarity in what they actually do and what their purpose is. And so it's no wonder it's difficult to align to the business purpose, because there kind of isn't a business purpose. Or it's a very mushy or very ill-defined business purpose. And in the past, that was less of a problem because things moved so slowly. You had these systems that were kind of, owned or managed in a way which was very needed big change to happen at the same one after another, and multiple different people coordinating that change in order to get a big change out of the door. Now, partly because of technology, but partly because of other techniques, we're able to make changes much more rapidly. And therefore, the organizations that are succeeding are those that have aligned their technology architecture to the kind of business, the streams of business change or the streams of organizational change that are needed. Approaches like Team Topologies are highlighting this mismatch basically between the kind of organizational business practices of the past and the ones that are possible with new techniques and new technologies.
Yeah, and you mentioned the inverse Conway maneuver or reverse Conway maneuver, which was, I think, to a large extent promoted by people like James Lewis from Thoughtworks. And there are many, to actually do it right, I think there are many aspects to consider. One is, I think, what Matthew just said around, if you don't understand what are your actual business streams of value, and you're not going to be able to match the architecture even to those streams of value, right? Because things are going to be sort of coupled, and you don't have a good understanding of what are the architecture services, if you like, that you want to decouple. And then there are other layers even of coupling where you might even have an architecture that looks more or less decoupled, but then teams still depend on each other because they share infrastructure or they share tooling or they are kind of interlocked with some processes in the organization. And so we still don't get the sort of autonomy and more independent teams working on different services because of that. So there are several layers, but starting obviously with what Matthew said, if you don't have clarity on what are your business streams, how can you even align either the system architecture or the teams to those streams? And going back to your question about complicated subsystems and platforms, so actually we call them complicated subsystem because we want to avoid the complex terminology because of Kinefin and the fact that usually kind of in situations where you have basically emergent things and properties that you cannot really control. But anyway, so for a complicated subsystem team, the starting point is that it would be too much cognitive load to that a streamlined team would be responsible for this complicated part of the system, right? So that's kind of a starting point, which means you might have one complicated subsystem which is only being used by one streamlined team, and that still makes sense because of reducing cognitive load on the streamlined team. What we see in terms of evolution in general, as the complicated subsystem, it might be in a constant flux of changes, but those systems tend to at some point start to kind of the cadence of change starts to slow down. And as the technology evolves, in many cases, you see kind of better solutions, more kind of third-party solutions. For example, we can talk about, I worked with systems that used face recognition subsystems, which was in fact complicated. You need a PhD to work on that. But these days you have good solutions out there. So you could, at some point, expect to move the complicated subsystem with some changes into a platform service where you rely more on a third party, perhaps, or it just has a very slow cadence of change. It doesn't justify having a team around it. And if we have the right kind of documentation support, then it can become part of a platform. In fact, we expect a complicated subsystem team to adopt very similar behaviors to platform teams in the way they provide that service or subsystem to other teams.
Yeah, we didn't put it in the book, but we've since realized a complicated subsystem is sort of like a mini platform. A lot of behaviors are very similar. We don't use exactly that terminology, but it's effectively that's how you should see it.
It's one of the challenges we've seen now that Team Topologies has been out for about a year and a half, and more organizations are adopting. We see a little bit. We see some organizations that think they need more complicated subsystem teams than they actually do, and that's, I think, related to the fact that this seem are more similar to the traditional component teams, which when you look at fast flow are typically a bit of a problem, causing bottleneck when you have many teams that depend on the same component team. So that's one of the challenges, understanding we should limit as much as possible the number of complicated subsystems and try to move them into the platform when possible.
Yeah, there's no real limit to the people who can read some insight and then apply their own worldview to it and then say, okay, we've got 1,700 complicated subsystems, actually just component teams, each working off in a release train across the whole organization.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were talking earlier around, trying to copy paste these models without actually, getting the underlying principles and ideas and why are we adopting this model.
I think just as a follow-up on the complicated subsystem, I think one of the challenges we see quite often is, and maybe this also mirrors to some of the points Matthew, you and Manuel were making about the purpose of an organization. I think a lot of time, I think we see now like when we go and try and identify what the business in double quotes is trying to do or achieve is, you sometimes end up getting pointed towards, well, you need to go and ask the team that manages system X or whatever. And really it's about it almost has the flip of the technology driving or defining what needs to be done. And in those sort of situations where systems tend to have become quite large, or they sort of almost are like they tend to define and control almost what's happening within the organization. The transition of those complicated subsystems, especially, and in that transition into what might ultimately become multiple streamlined teams, what was in that transition, what are the things you would suggest people consider or look out for, or what might that transition potentially look like?
That's a nice question. Before we wrote the book, we actually did some work for an organization, global organization, but this particular part of it was based in the UK. And Emmanuel and I were working on the on kind of getting continuous delivery in place, so deployment pipelines and stuff like that. But there was a huge monolithic system in place already, and there was some really interesting and quite some